5 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the key tenets of the Scottish Government's named person scheme were unlawful. In this series, we're looking back at that long road to victory, hearing from some of those involved in that historic legal win and the campaigning that went along with it. This time, as we consider the No to Named Persons campaign, a campaign spearheaded by the Christian Institute, I'm joined by our Deputy Director for Public Affairs, Simon Calvert, who was the spokesperson for No to MP and heavily involved in its day-to-day running. Simon, thank you for joining me today to talk about this important issue. Can you just start by talking us through why the CI wanted to get involved in this campaign?
Well, it's funny, I've just, preparing for this interview, been looking back over the stories that came to our attention at the start of the campaign and the people, some of whom became friends as part of this campaign. And to see the way in which this scheme was being promoted that was so invasive to ordinary family life, it was really very shocking to see. And so we knew that we needed to do something about it. I mean, as Christians, we also knew that the more power you give to the state over family life, if you give excessive power and it gets used against all kinds of different people, you can be pretty sure that Christians will suffer too. Because, as Christians, we have a different set of beliefs from the society around us. And so we were particularly concerned that the named person scheme could be used to single out Christian parents who are seeking to raise their children in the faith. And so there were lots of reasons, but just the basic injustice of the scheme was really a strong motivator.
So the campaign is launched, but it's fair to say that not everybody was on side with the issue.
Well, I mean, initially it was interesting the way in which we were so quickly able to bring together such a disparate range of individuals and groups, people from such a wide range of backgrounds, across the philosophical and political spectrum. But yes, I mean, when we first started speaking out against the named person scheme, when we first launched the No to Named Persons campaign, of course, you had some scepticism from the press and from many of the politicians. You had really a quite disgraceful tendency to try and portray our opposition as something, motivated by some kind of deep, nefarious motives. And, it was really quite shocking to see the way in which people tried to write off people and their concerns. But very quickly, we were able to expose what was really going on with real cases. We were able to show the intentions of government and those behind the scheme by quoting from things they themselves had said. And so any skepticism in the media very quickly turned to a real sympathy, a real understanding for what we were saying. And so, from fairly early on in the campaign, the people who were really on the back foot were the government and the defenders of the scheme.
But you had a great team of people working on the campaign, didn't you?
So one of the great things about this campaign was all the different people we were working with. When you have people like Alison Price and Stuart Waiton and Leslie Scott and all these others working with you, it's fantastic because they're such amazing thinkers, they're such hard-working people, they're so creative, and so they're digging up material all the time, they are combing through reports coming out of these dull government committees. They are, spotting the arguments. They're unearthing the material which, the campaign would then use to push forward. And that was just a wonderful experience. It was a really, cooperative effort. And and to people like Leslie Scott and Alison Price and others, you could also see what it meant to them personally, how much it mattered to them and to the people, the constituencies that they represented. And that was really great for our motivation. It was a wonderful campaign to be a part of. It really was.
So what kind of things, what kind of arguments were used to help change perceptions and change the face of public opinion?
So the government often hid behind the idea that this was a scheme to help with child protection. But number one, we already have an extensive child protection regime. And number two, this was, when you looked again at what they actually said, was expressly not child protection. This was meant to be something else, something different. And so that contradiction in the government's argument was helpful. We were also able to tap into people's concerns about privacy. At the core of the named person scheme was legal powers for the state to grab and share personal private information on children and their families with a huge range of agencies. And we quickly spotted that this couldn't possibly be compliant with laws on data protection, and was just profoundly invasive. And again, that was quite easy to show that was one of the real risks of this, one of the real dangers. And people are, rightly concerned about their privacy. And so there was a lot of sympathy for that. We were also able to show how the named person scheme, rather than helping vulnerable children and providing help to families that wanted it, actually the risk was it would do the exact opposite, because it tied up resources in investigating just ordinary families where nothing was really going wrong. And it dragged some of the people who should have been involved in child protection into sort of vetting all this trivia about parents and their children and ordinary decisions which should not be the business of the state. So actually, the child protection services were going to find themselves overwhelmed with all of this irrelevant trivia and having to wade through it in order to actually identify the real cases where children were actually at risk of abuse, or the cases where families were begging for help and not getting it. I mean, I felt very strongly personally motivated. I also knew that we had a very, very strong argument and just such a lot of information, such a lot of proof, proving all the things that were wrong with the scheme. And actually, I have to confess that some of the stuff was just really quite amusing. Some of the stuff that defenders of the scheme would say was just an absolute gift to us.
What were those kind of things? What would they say?
For example, one of the defenders of the scheme decided to try and explain it by using some laboured analogy of a gardener. But the conclusion of this analogy was that in the lives of children were the plants, their parents were gardeners, and the named person was the head gardener. So just making very clear that they regarded the named person as the person who was in charge of and responsible for parents and how they parented their children.
You had people working on the social media side of things. How important is it in this day and age to embrace things like social media as well as the traditional press?
Well, in any campaign, you just have to identify all the different ways in which you can engage with real people. And of course, everybody knows that social media is one of the ways that you can engage with real people. And I'm one of those people that thinks it's important, and it's very important, but it's not the whole thing. You have to do much more than that. I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that Twitter is the real world. It's not. And people can read all kinds of things on Twitter and do nothing about it. They can say all kinds of things on Twitter but not do anything in the real world to actually try and solve the problems. So social media was a really important way of getting our message out, a really important way of engaging with our supporters, and a really important way of helping to persuade undecided people of our argument. But it was just one of the ways that we did it. Traditional mainstream media was another key part of that. And then meetings, getting face-to-face with people. I mean, the people involved in the No to Named Persons campaign spent a lot of time on the road, travelling all over Scotland, getting face-to-face with people, explaining the problems with the Named Persons scheme, listening to people's stories, handling their questions, and helping to persuade them that they needed to get actively involved in helping to fight this. And that worked.
When you're doing things like public meetings or you're out on the streets talking to people, it's quite easy to gauge how the public is feeling about these kind of things. It's a little bit different though, I suppose, when you're doing social media and you've got broadcast media and newspapers. How did you feel that things were going during the early days of the campaign?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a disconnect between the media, social media, and the real world, and you can get three completely different impressions, by looking at those things. And obviously, the real world is the most important. Early on in the campaign, talking to people, we knew that people cared about this, and we knew that there was an instinctive hostility to the idea of the state forcing families to have a named person, a state guardian, combing through their private information and giving them advice which they felt that they couldn't ignore. So yeah, we knew from the responses we were getting from people that this was an issue that was catching on, and it perhaps social media started to take off next. Mainstream media, as I say, that fairly quickly turned very much in our favour as journalists, could see for themselves what the named person scheme was going to mean. The place and the people that were slowest to catch on were the politicians and civil servants, and some of those in shall we say voluntary sector organisations that were defending the government policy. It took them a very long time to recognise what was wrong with the scheme, how strongly people felt about it. But by the end of the campaign, even in those circles, there was a change of mind, and people who had previously defended the named person scheme to the hilt, late in the day, came around to realising that that perhaps there were problems after all.
Why do you think there was that disconnect between the public and the politicians or those in those various organisations defending the scheme?
Oh, well, this is a big theme. I mean, I could talk about this all day, but one of the reasons is that often people in politics and in the public sector and people kind of high up in these voluntary groups, they just mix with one another and they don't mix with ordinary people. I mean, they'll get photo opportunities with ordinary people, but they don't actually spend meaningful time listening to ordinary people, and they don't respect their views. They often think that their views are sort of not worth listening to, or they default to writing people off as either stupid or motivated by hatred or some other nefarious motive, and that makes them quite isolated from people. So I think that's one of the reasons. And you also can't underestimate the extent to which people will seek to justify a decision that they've already made, and they will double down on it, rather than, as you would hope, for ministers and civil servants, being willing to listen to criticism and take a step back and think, have we got this right? Often people in politics will just double down and they'll defend what they've done to the last possible minute. And, that's exactly what we saw in this case. The Scottish Government and, John Swinney in particular, sought to defend this scheme long past the point at which anybody was really going to be persuaded. Take, for example, the day we won the Supreme Court case, John Swinney takes to Twitter and says, "I'm glad this attempt to scrap the named person scheme has failed." I mean, he was living in another world. And on that day, one of the journalists outside the Supreme Court came up to me and showed me this press statement from the Scottish Government making out that they'd won the case. And they were genuinely saying to me, perhaps they've accidentally sent out the "we've won" press release instead of the "we've lost" press release that they'd prepared in advance. That was the level of disconnect that you had. But, fair play to John Swinney. By the end of things, he was willing to sit down and talk with us, on one occasion at least. And, he did, in the end, admit that they couldn't legislate for this named person scheme in the way that they wanted. They couldn't have the statutory scheme. They couldn't have all these elaborate data sharing powers that they wanted. So, yeah, he did the right thing in the end.
Because it was about 3 years after the Supreme Court victory that they eventually stopped down. Why do you think it took quite so long?
Well, because they were in their own bubble. They were still trying to persuade themselves that they were sort of the champions of the family. I mean, one of the difficulties of this campaign, one of the upsetting things, was the way in which the government would try to make themselves out to be the people who really cared about children and families, and that those of us on the other side therefore didn't care about children and families. No, I think they talked themselves into a corner, and I think that they had just invested too much capital in it. I think if early on they'd been willing to listen to criticism and been willing to sit down and talk with us early on, rather than announcing to the Scottish Parliament, you know, we will never sit down and talk with no to named persons. I think if they'd listened early on, you know, they might have seen the flaws and realised that they were going to need to do something about it. But, you know, we won in the end.
And I suppose lastly, really, what was your reaction, what was your response when you heard that 5-0 result at the Supreme Court?
Oh, when we won the court case, I mean, I was just absolutely overjoyed. And what I knew, what really struck me was, this was good news for millions of people. I thought millions of people are going to see the news today about this court win, and it's going to put a smile on their face. They're going to be happy about this result because it's a just result, it's a good result, it's a great result for the privacy of families. So, yeah, it was just great to feel that we'd been a part of something which was going to be welcomed by millions of people across Scotland, across the UK and beyond.
Brilliant. Simon, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.